Yes, ma'am.
All right, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the January 9th, 2024 meeting of the Mecklenburg County Environmental Stewardship Committee. I'm Commissioner Susan Rodriguez McDowell, and I am sitting in for our chair just for a little while until she's able to join us. She's out in the nasty storm, but I'm sure she'll be joining as soon as possible. We are fully virtual today, and we are committed to the important work of maintaining and enhancing our environment so that all residents can thrive. So we welcome the public who have been provided a call-in number to access this meeting. Those attending virtually are asked to display your full name on Zoom, as attendance is recorded for the minutes. Additionally, virtual attendees are asked to remain muted and use the chat box to submit comments to be read aloud to the committee. The agenda, meeting minutes, and presentations for today were sent out to those already on the distribution list. If anyone did not receive these and would like electronic copies of any presentation materials provided today, please make those requests via email to Erin Stanforth. Her email address is erin.stanforth@mecnc.gov. Okay, so we will begin today's meeting by introducing our committee members. And I will start on, well, actually, I guess you don't know that she's on my left. Commissioner Altman, please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you.
All right, and Commissioner Durrell.
Good afternoon, Mark.
All right, so for the record, we do have a quorum with 3 of the 4 members present. And I will now ask Erin Stanforth to assist with introductions for our staff members today.
Certainly. Thank you, Commissioner. With us online, we have Kathleen Reed, Amanda Byram, Bart Landis, Bert Lynn, Chris Matthews, Clint Brooks, Dave Cable, Don Ciccarelli, Ebenezer Jarlaputi, Gordon Miller, Juliana Hawley, Leslie Johnson, Maureen Galewski. I know I pronounced that wrong. Apologies, Maureen. Jacqueline McNeil, Olivia Edwards, Pamela Escobar, Sean Bloom, Shauna Caldwell, and Krista Rogers, and myself, Erin Stanforth.
And Lee Jones.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. So the first thing that we will do is entertain a motion to approve the December 12th, 2023 meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Commissioner Durrell has made the motion and Commissioner Altman has seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. The meeting minutes are approved. Okay. So we will begin our meeting with our first agenda item, and I will now recognize Chris Matthews, Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation Division Director for Nature Preserves and Natural Resources, to continue our discussion around land protection in Mecklenburg County. This is a continuation from our last meeting. Take it away.
Great. Chris. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Erin, did you want to start with any introductory comments, or you just want me to dive into it?
I can, sure. So our last meeting, for those that weren't here, we talked about all the different land protection options that Mecklenburg County currently employs. It was requested that we take what we presented last time and take it a step further, give some examples and maybe some more background around how we actually use those different tools. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris because he's our internal expert on this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin. So if you remember last time, we had talked about a variety of strategies that and processes and procedures that the counties use to protect land. We talked about different types of funding. A lot of this funding comes from the state level. We talked about the use of conservation easements. We talked about the fact that on many of our properties, we have tree save, which the city requires when we do certain types of development. We talked about historic designations and how they provide some level of protection and oversight on some of our properties. Stormwater talked a little about some of their FEMA buyout properties and what some of the restrictions look like on those. And we talked about deed restrictions as a way to kind of control how land is developed and uses and they can and can't happen in the future. So I think after that meeting, we had a request that said, hey, can we dive into a little more deeply on how some of these strategies are used on parklands, especially in locations where we have like multiple things going on all at one time. So that's what we've done. We've pulled together a couple of slides to talk about that. And then I think what we're going to do after that is we're going to hear from both Catawba Lands Conservancy and Davidson Lakes Conservancy on some of the stuff that they do. So the first one that we want to talk about is Reedy Creek Park and Nature Preserve. So as you can see from this slide, there's a whole lot going on out at Reedy. And so what we'll do is just kind of talk about all the various things that we have going on out there. So the red that you see is a whole series of conservation easements that were put on streams that were either restored or preserved as part of a project that we did with the city of Charlotte. The city spent a whole lot of money fixing the streams out here that had, quite frankly, been destroyed by past agricultural practices. And so in order for the city to feel good about the money that they were investing, and in order for them to receive credits for the work that they did, they put conservation easements on it. So all the red that you see is a strip of land that covers all the streams, and it limits what can happen in those corridors. So we're allowed to do trails and we're allowed to take care of invasive species, but obviously we're not going to build something in that location. So on top of that, when Reedy was purchased back in the day by the city and then subsequently given over to the county, there were deed restrictions that were put on some of the parcels that were put together to create the property. So the parcels that you see that have the D on it are deed restrictions that basically said this is always going to be a park, and county, if you decide that you're going to do something different with it, you got to let us know. And oh, by the way, if we want to put a sewer in it or a water line or something like that, we have the ability to do it. There were some limitations on how big those things could be, but the city provided some level of infrastructure for them to go back in on some of the parcels. Now, some of the parcels don't have a deed on them because they were purchased after the fact, and the county didn't put a deed restriction. So for example, the parcel on the far left that has the little tooth notch out of the bottom of it is a recent acquisition that we did, and that does not have a deed restriction on it. The parcels that you see in orange are parcels that used state funding, in this case LWCF, to help partially fund the purchase of the parcels. So 50% of the purchase price was used using LWCF funds. And these funds basically say, hey, if you're gonna buy something with these parcels, it's got to stay a park forever. So as you can see, there's a big mismatch, and some of them lay on top of one another. So in some of the parcels where there's red and there's a green D, like you can see underneath, and orange, there's actually 3 layers of protection that reside on that one piece, on that one parcel. Additionally, you can see some of the dotted lines over there on the right-hand side of the slide. These are utility easements. So these are sewer lines, electrical lines, and other utilities that also sit in there. And these allow for the utility companies to come in and fix things or do maintenance on it. So any questions about Reedy Creek?
Do you want to
cool.
speak? Do you want to speak to this one little square right here, Chris?
Oh, yeah. Well, and this is an interesting little feature. So we have a historic site out there called Robinson Rock House. And Robinson Rock House is a noted historic location. It's a very old ruin, essentially. It's not really standing anymore, but you can see the foundation, some of the walls that are out there. And so it's an area that's designated as historic. Again, sitting kind of out there in the middle of the property. Thanks, Aaron. Okay, Fisher Farm Park. So the park that you see here is the tan property outlined in the bright green. This has a couple of layers of protection that have been put on it. One is this is noted that this property is owned by the town of Davidson. Way a long time ago, Mecklenburg County and Davidson got together and decided to put a conservation easement on it to preserve and protect this property. So we as the county hold the easement on a property owned by the town of Davidson. And they have to check with us whenever they want to do something dramatic or change a use or something like that. So it's a way to have a conversation about things that happen out there, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that the changes are consistent with the use of what that property is. In addition to that, you can see there are some utility lines that kind of cross the property in a couple of locations. And then the blue area, the state of North Carolina came in and did a stream restoration project out there on a tributary to the West Branch of the Rocky River. And they put a conservation easement around it, similar to what the city did in Reedy. It's a typical standard practice to make sure that the investment that they made in fixing the stream is protected over the long term. So Fisher Farm is an example of a conservation easement, two different types of conservation easements on one property to help protect that property. Any other comments or things about Fisher Farm that I may have missed or questions?
Yes, can I just ask briefly, and I went back and read, last week's minutes to try to refresh myself, but am I missing something about where Mecklenburg County holds the conservation easement on another town, like the town of Davidson's property?
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. So we don't only put conservation easements on our own property, but we can put it on other properties within our, boundaries. Is that right?
So typically, a property owner can't hold an easement on its own property. And so typically a different party will hold the conservation easement on it. And Bart and Dave may want to weigh in on this as well. But the point of the conservation easement is to make sure that you're not doing something on your property that you shouldn't do. And that's almost like the fox and the hen house. If you hold your own easement on your own property, then someone else is not really making sure that you're living up to what you said you were going to live up to. So in this particular case, because the town of Davidson owns the property, a third party, in this case the county, has the conservation easement, so it's kind of like a check and balance. Or Dave, you got any other comments about that process?
Yeah, I would just jump in, Kristen, thanks. The conservation easement, as I understand it, which was put in place pretty much simultaneous with the purchase, was a requirement by the county for their funding. It was a club deal with both entities participating in the acquisition. And that was a condition that, okay, we're using county funds to buy a park. Let's make sure that it stays a park. And Chris raises a really good point about this, merger of interest. It's an important concept in the conservation world that the entity that owns the land does not hold the conservation easement. It's the tension between those two ownerships that makes sure that the terms of that easement are upheld forever. And the legal theory behind that, and I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, the legal theory is that if one entity owns both interests, because we're talking about a property right here through the conservation easement, then there's the potential merger of those interests, which would negate the significance of the conservation easement. So in Peter Rabbit terms, those two interests need to stay separate. And again, it's that monitoring and that tension and that interplay between the owner and the conservation easement holder that ensures that those conservation values are forever protected.
Wow, thank you. That's really helpful.
Can I jump in also? I think the desire of many of us, if not all of us, is that decisions that we've made to protect land and money that we have allocated, precious dollars we have managed to wrangle for the purpose of acquiring public land to be held and used for the public to benefit, not to be used for something else that may be valuable, like affordable housing or schools or what have you. These are all good things, but I think there's a desire that if we have, as a board, decided to allocate dollars to purchase land for park and greenways or what have you, nature preserves, that it stay that way. That's my understanding for why we're having all this information and briefing. And so I kind of want to cut to the chase, because this committee should not be trying to figure out the right legal vehicle to make that work, for us to sort of have a crash course in what an easement is and who can hold it and how, all of that. I mean, it's interesting, but I don't think it's the best use of time. What we really need is chronicling of all of our assets that are currently, purchased and were designated to be like green space that we bought. And what of that is not deed restricted and therefore vulnerable to being changed for its purpose by a future board. And to have our legal team tell us the most expedient mechanism to protect it, understanding that it could always be undone by a future board if they want to go through enough hoops, but to make it a little more protected than some of it may be now. That's where I see us needing to go. That's where I think, I think that's where we are right now, where I think we want to go. And so, I just don't want commissioners to be in the position of trying to figure out what to ask for, because we shouldn't have to. We need our lawyers to tell us how to effectuate the outcome we're trying to get to.
Thank you for your comments, Commissioner Altman. I just want to say that, I respect what you're saying about, we shouldn't be trying to figure this out. But I really also want to say that I really appreciate getting the background knowledge and this presentation, is extremely helpful to me to sort of, get the background. And so I don't think we want to stray from what we have on here today, but if you want to talk about how we move forward at our next meeting, I think that's fair.
No, I'm happy to continue with the presentation as it's going, but it just concerns me because the discussion around easements is more complicated than what we're getting. And I'm afraid that we'll come away with half understanding when we shouldn't have to figure it out in the first place. So I'm more than happy to continue as planned for today, but with those caveats.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I respect where you're coming from, especially as an attorney, which I am not. So I really appreciate your perspective.
And I do see that Dr. Johnson, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure if anybody can see, and I didn't know if it was appropriate to raise my hand or not. So I understand both perspectives. I think what Commissioner Powell was trying to do is just to make sure that everyone has some general common knowledge with regards to where we have used them and alike, how one of these easements is one of the tools that we can do to protect. We did hear some of the commentary that was shared at the last meeting with regards to individuals' opinions, though it was not, we heard individuals' opinions with regards to the interest. Staff has heard and understands from those individual opinions the desired and interest. Staff is positioned and have had conversations with the legal team about best ways to try to approach it, of which there may be probably multiple options, not a singular path that would probably be recommended, but that's yet to come before you. I think, again, Commissioner Powell was trying to ensure that you individually and collectively have a perspective, and then for you individually and collectively to be able to have conversation and dialogue to determine how do you want to recommend the path forward. And then we as staff would share what would be the next steps to try to make that happen, depending on what was the feedback in this group's discussions.
Thank you, Dr.
You're
John.
welcome.
And just, I would like to double check with Commissioner Durrell. I saw your hand was up and then you took it down. Does that mean you no longer have a question or?
Yeah, I'll wait to the end of the presentation. I kind of, just to piggyback a little bit off of Commissioner Altman, I really wanted us to dig into, and I was really interested to hear Bart's assessment of some of the discussion at the end of the meeting, our last meeting. That's really where I'm hoping that we can drill down on, because that was sort of the meat of where we're going. And I'm not sure if Dave was on the line or not, but I really would like to hear about that tension between where we were basically, and I'm paraphrasing the discussion, but basically I think Dr. Johnson was saying, hey, folks, make sure that, or my words were, make sure that we don't have unintended consequences by our actions, but also respecting the fact where we as commissioners want to go with full protection, you know, of these spaces and places that are critical areas for the county. But I really want to just make sure, Commissioner, that we have enough time to maybe drill down on that with hearing from Bart and Dave on that as well, because since they were both had the opportunity to hear and certainly respect their opinions. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's
And
proceed.
I'm sorry, Madam Chairwoman, can I say one more thing, even though I want to be sensitive about time?
Okay.
I want someone to tell me either now or at some point in this meeting, can the county put an easement on a property it already owns when it's not transferring an interest to somebody else? I think the answer is no. I don't think you.
That is correct. Legally, we cannot put an easement on our own property.
Right. So we shouldn't be, if we're talking, if the primary problem here is trying to protect what we already own, we shouldn't even be talking about easements because we can't give it to ourselves. And that's part of why I'm confused about the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so Chris, do you want to continue?
Yeah, sure. So the next slide that we're going to look at is an example of a conglomeration of properties where we have properties that don't have a legal protection on it, but they are combined with properties that do have a conservation easement on it, in this case held by the Catawba Lands Conservancy. So these are properties up near Latta, just to the east of Latta at Gar Creek Nature Preserve. And you can see that there's a variety of things going on in this particular location. So the green, the darker green are properties that we manage that don't have a layer of legal protection on it other than the fact that we own it. The red ones are ones that are covered by the conservation easement that Catawba Lands Conservancy holds. The brown property that you see in the bottom right is a property that we bought for a future park. So that's going to be an active park with ball fields and those kinds of things. It just happens to be in the same area. And then we've got some parcels, the bright green over there by Beatty's Ford on the west side and left side of the property. We consider that Gar Creek, but because it's not attached, we just kind of manage those as an unnamed property. So this is an example of where we work with Catawba Lands Conservancy. They go out and they'll walk the properties in red. They'll come back to us and say, hey, everything looks great. It looks awesome. Or they come back and say, hey, we've got like people hunting or some folks that are riding ATVs. And then we'll, if we don't know about it, usually we know about it, but if we don't know about it, then we'll go out and take care of that situation and rectify it. This series of properties is really important for us because Gar Creek, which flows into Mountain Island Lake through Latta Nature Preserve, is the cleanest, if it's one of the cleanest, if not the cleanest creek that we have. And so protecting land around this is really important for maintaining our drinking water, high quality drinking water supply. So it's real important for us to protect these lands, and we continually look for opportunities to buy additional land in this watershed to make sure that Gar Creek stays as clean as it can. Let's look at the next one. so this one maybe kind of goes to the point that Commissioner Altman was making. So we received this property called Rocky River Bluff Nature Preserve a while back, probably in the early 2000s. And we bought this property from a gentleman who had a disc golf course on it. And we allowed the disc golf course to remain even though we bought the property. At some time later, though, it actually became a problem. And the work that he was doing out there wasn't consistent with our conservation goals. We felt like that we needed to put some more protection on it. So we actually worked with Catawba Lands Conservancy, even though we already own the property, for them to put a conservation easement on this property because we wanted to have them help us protect it. So CLC came out, they agreed to do it. So we put a conservation easement on the property. Subsequently, because of the creation of Davidson Lands Conservancy, this conservation easement got transferred over to Davidson because they handle the properties in the north part of the county. So now this conservation, we work with Dave Cable and his organization to basically enforce the conservation easement there. This was really instrumental in helping us remove the disc golf course from the property. So we sunset that agreement and we've been able to provide additional protection out there. Now, after that happened, we, as you guys know, and we talked about this last meeting, there's a board action from 2002 that says we're going to pursue state dedications, which are conservation easements on all nature preserves. So after we entered this agreement with Catawba Lands Conservancy and then Davidson Lands Conservancy, the state actually came out and said, you know what? This property is so amazing. And it's got such amazing natural resources. We want to add this property is eligible for a state dedication. So we put another conservation easement on top of it. So now this property is doubly protected by two conservation easements that will protect this super high quality, very rare and unique property in perpetuity. It will never be developed and will always be there for people to go out and enjoy. So this is an example of a piece of property that we owned, that we reached out to other organizations to put conservation easements on it to help us protect it. Okay, Clark's Creek Nature Preserve. So this property is an interesting property too, because you see the road that kind of bisects the green. On the north side of the road is Clark's Creek Nature Preserve, and on the south side of the road is Clark's Creek Park. The nature preserve came first, the park came later. The nature preserve, a number of years ago, the state came in and said, hey, we want to do a stream restoration on it. And so they came in and did the stream restoration, and then they put a conservation easement on it, which you can see the perpetual conservation easement, which is kind of the redder of the two colors. After that happened, we came in and we built a small shelter with a parking lot and a playground on the nature preserve side. As part of that development, the city came in and said, hey, we need to have you put some tree save in. So in addition to having a conservation easement out there, we also have tree save. And that's the pink that you can see. And the tree save limits what can happen in that forested section of the nature preserve. So not only do we have the state protecting the watershed around the stream, we also have the city holding a perpetual easement for tree save, which allows us to go in and clear invasives, but we can't go in and build a building there. So, and this is something that happens on a fairly regular basis with us in the city through their development and zoning requirements. We often are challenged with finding locations for tree save on our property. And it actually helps us protect our property, even though it limits some of the things that we can do. Any questions about the last two that I talked about?
Yeah, just so I understand, we are asking third parties to, for us to grant them an easement that is ideologically aligned with protecting the environment. Is that basically what's happening here?
That's, well, in some cases, that is correct. So in the previous slide, the Rocky River Bluff one, we have almost 10 properties that we've approached the state on and said, please put a conservation easement on our property so that you can help us protect this in perpetuity. And that's the board action that the board came up with in 2002. So staff is continuing to, and not all of our properties are eligible for it because of the type of resource, but of the properties that have the resources that the state is wanting to protect, we are still actively pursuing conservation easements with the state of North Carolina to help protect those properties.
It would be interesting to know, why is that a better way to go about it than us changing the deed of our own property to put whatever restrictions we want in it?
So perhaps Jacqueline or somebody else can answer this question. My understanding is that a deed restriction is much easier to change in general. A conservation easement is something that is much, much more difficult to change. So if our resources are so unique and special, we want to put the highest level of protection that we can. Now, if we had parkland, maybe a deed restriction might be a better solution, and a conservation easement might be too restrictive or too, just too much for that property. And so I think what we're trying to show in this series of slides is there are different tools that can be used for different properties based on whatever the future use is likely to be or intended to be. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll weigh in, Chris, and then I don't know if Jacqueline wants to or not, but Chris is exactly where what we're seeing from a staff perspective is it's not a one size fits all, that you have to have different types of tools for the different types of scenarios of what we have in our portfolio. And that there are some that are already working quite well with us, our partnership with the Catawba Land Conservancy, things that we have with the state, and those things we should continue to pursue and align. And then there may be another subset for some other things, but I think it's not a one size fits all.
And a deed restriction, we can unilaterally change, but an easement, we would need the person we granted it to agree. Is that right?
Yes and no. There are some other things that are legally starting to show up even with the deed restriction. So I would rather us, if we go down this path, that we eventually want to be able to share with you what would be staff's recommendations for all these different alternatives and how to use them, that we also leverage our attorneys. I know at the last call we had Susan Hall that was a part of that was online with us, and she wasn't able, I guess she's not on today. But that would be what we would want to ensure that we're doing, that we're leveraging our real estate attorney's opinions as to how we proceed with those options.
All right, thank you. If there's no more questions, Chris, do you have more?
That's all I had for right now. I think it looks like the next portion is going to be CLC DLC presentation. So I'm obviously going to stay on and can answer any questions, but I'll turn it over to Bart and Dave.
All right, before you do that, let me just make sure and give Commissioner Jarrell and Commissioner Altman, if there's any other questions that they had on this portion, let's go ahead and do that.
I'm good to go. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Okay, so let us move on. I will now recognize Dave Cable from the Davidson Lands Conservancy and Amanda Byram from the Catawba Lands Conservancy. They will speak on conserving key nature preserves and parks in Mecklenburg County.
Thank you, Susan, for having me. I really appreciate it. And I am so grateful for the partnership that we have with the county. I've been at this for about 20 years, and to be able to work with people like Krista and Chris and others with the county has been a great joy and honor. And as a partner, in partnership, I think we've been able to accomplish a lot together. And I hope that we can just continue to do that and expand it. I did want to take the time here at the very front end before we even get into the slides and just cover a couple of really key points that I am super passionate about and feel really strongly about. And I think they they get to the bottom of why this is important, and some of the benefits of a conservation easement. And to pick up on Dr. Johnson's comment, it is not for every piece of land. Fortunately, it's a great tool that we can use, but it's not like we should run around and put easements on all this land. That is not what this is about. So let me run through a couple of key points here, and then we can very quickly go through the slides, and hopefully they will reinforce. The first is that, as all of you know, the pressures on our lands are phenomenal. And with that comes really rapid development and certainly high land prices. And as a conservationist, what that means is that we need to be really strategic about what we're doing. These pieces of land are core to the future of our community, and they're under phenomenal pressures. And as we wind forward in the years and decades ahead, the pressure is only going to increase. So that's the first point, and all of you are well aware of that. The conservation of some of these key lands as we do grow, I think there's a strong argument that they are a very important part of resilience for our community, which I know is a core principle within the Environmental Leadership Action Plan. So I think this is an important part of how we manage our landscapes going forward for resilience and sustainability. Number two, this is not a random walk of conservation. We're talking about very strategic placement of conservation easements and protections on those lands that are most precious and important to the future of our community, recognizing the linkage between what goes on in the land and everything else in the environment. It is the core place for the impacts on the environment happen on the land. It affects the air, water, ground, soil, trees, obviously everything. And these lands, these precious lands that have been identified for conservation, have served us well for 300 years, and they've served the Catawba Nation for 10,000 years. They've been stewarded, and they need to be protected. And while we don't know what's around the corner in much regards of anything, I think it's very easy to get ourselves comfortable with we should put a stake in the ground to conserve these precious lands, again, strategically. Number three is that our lands are vulnerable not just to the pressures of growth, but also to other pressures. I mean, the future fiscal health of government, the pressures on the land that the county already owns, changes in leadership priorities, those are all important. And ultimately, all the land use controls that we all rely on, swim buffers, definitions of wetlands, zoning, those are all in the political realm. They are all subject to change. And it has led me to really firmly believe over these 20 years of slugging this out is that land really needs to fit mentally into one of two classes. It's either protected or it's unprotected, because everything else is up for grabs. And I think that's particularly true in North Carolina, given the limitations of local government to self-determine. I mean, we are largely directed and limited by what we can do here as by what goes on in Raleigh. And that makes it important that we be able to put a stake in the ground beyond what is in the political realm. Number four is the irreversibility of development. Many of you probably were around, I know Lee was, when the whole Little Sugar Creek Greenway, thank you, Ruth Samuelson, for pulling that off. And there was an attempt to restore and return something to its natural environment. And the cost of that is just phenomenally expensive. We are much better off getting out in front of this and protecting these really important assets on the front end. And lastly, there is no better instrument for long-term protection of land than conservation easements. And the reason for that is that they are legally and institutionally accepted. There's about 60 million acres in the country that are protected by conservation easement. And unlike a deed restriction, you have a specific agency, in this case, a local land trust, whose job it is and endowed to do is to monitor that conservation easement and protect it. And that sets a special set of circumstances to protect the value of that land and its conservation values. Chris talked about multiple layers of protection, and I think it's always good to think in terms of multiple layers of protection. And then lastly, I will say this, and I had my eyes open to this in a number of occasions over the years, The public expects parkland to be parkland. And we recently had this in the case of Abersham, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more in a second. But when we were looking at the stream restoration project that the county is doing there, justified by the fact that this is parkland, largely by parkland, and they're going to make this investment, it was a real eye-opener for the public who got involved in the analysis of that project to learn that that park is actually not protected. And so many of the people in the community expect that. So those are some core pieces of this that I think are important to get out on the table. And now we can kind of quickly go through the slides that I hope will reinforce some of those concepts.
Excuse me, but can I do a couple quick things that are based upon our earlier comments? And thanks for that great introduction. And thank you, commissioners, for having us. The big maybe analogy that you can maybe use and be helpful in analyzing how to do conservation easements is that, as Commissioner Altman said, you cannot create an easement on a piece of property that you own, but you can grant an easement on that property. And that's the big distinction that got mentioned several times, but I just thought it'd be useful to say it at that high level. The second one is in these multiple layers of protection, and today is a great example of this. Sometimes you want a sweater and a raincoat, and that's true for many of these properties. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
So these nature preserves and parks, they are expected by the majority of the people in our community to be permanent and to be available. They are vital infrastructure in our community. And as I think about infrastructure, we don't buy sewer easements temporarily. We buy a sewer easement. And I think putting a stake in the ground on the importance of these, again, very strategic lands is an important thing to do. And Bart, thanks for making that point. That's where this partnership with the conservancies and the county is so important. And fortunately, both Catawba Lands Conservancy, Davidson Lands Conservancy, both part of a network of land trusts. There are about 400 of them that are accredited. There are about 1,000 of them in the country. We've got 2 accredited ones local, and we've been shown to be great partners with the county over time in a variety of different circumstances. The pieces we're talking about protecting are of strategic importance across the platform of nature and people. And with all of this in play, and with all the pressures and unknowns about the political environment and land use controls, why would we want to leave all of this up for grabs? Next slide. So you've all seen this chart. Don't need to belabor this. The pressures are phenomenal. I will say this to you all. I would love for us to be in partnership with the county and think about updating this analysis. We did this back in 2006 and 7 in partnership with the UNCC Geospatial Unit. We've been through a variety of different recessions and growth periods. It would be very interesting to revisit this. So this is just a little bit of a pitch on how these have been very handy to visualize what otherwise would be the frog in the warming pot of water. Next slide, please. So this important connection between land and everything else. This is an aerial view that Sharon Wilson took of Johnson Creek coming out into Mountain Island Lake upstream of the water intake. This happened in February following a January clear cut of a forest above up into Johnson Creek. And, runoff is our #1 issue here. And there is this immediate direct connection in terms of water quality and what goes on to the land. That's exemplary of the connections to the groundwater, to trees, what goes on in the air, and obviously people's enjoyment of the land too, and wildlife. Next slide, please. So one of the beauties of conservation easements, and Chris touched on this, is their flexibility. When I talk about flexibility, I'm not talking about flexibility once they are cast, although they can be amended, but flexibility in terms of accommodating a reasonable use of the property while very clearly identifying conservation values and putting into place the restrictions to ensure those conservation values are forever protected. That's what a conservation easement does. And it's a legal agreement that gets recorded in the land records. That flexibility is important whether we're talking about public land conservation or private land conservation. It catches the nexus, it meets the nexus of where the property's use as expected by the property owner, in this case, the county, and where those conservation values are. It's that nexus that is struck by a good conservation easement to forever protect those, but allow for reasonable use of the property. It is recognized by state and federal law. It's promoted by the tax code and public policy. And the uses that are restricted can be very, very specific. And that's where this combination of identifying the conservation values and the flexibility of the easement will allow us to craft things that allow for reasonable uses, but also protect those conservation values. And as Chris also pointed out, many times funders for conservation projects will require that the properties be permanently protected. Land and Water Fund is a good example of that. And in fact, Mecklenburg County required this on Fisher Farm. So the way that worked is the town wanted to buy it. The county said they'd help. They put some money into it. They required a conservation easement to be retained by the county. The county holds the easement. County contracts with the Conservancy to monitor that easement and steward it. And we're in partnership with the county and the town to improve not only the protection of those values, but enhance that property through its management. It's that partnership that will maximize the conservation values long-term in the community. Next slide. So they're institutionally accepted. I mentioned this earlier. There's about 61 million acres under conservation easement. It's very common across all 50 states. The funds are typically endowed by the easement holder. So in this case, the Davidson Lands Conservancy holds an easement on the Rocky River Bluff Nature Preserve. We have set aside a chunk of money that's specific to ensure that we are going to be here forever to actually steward, monitor, and legally defend that conservation easement for all time. So you've got an agency that's responsible for the easement, and then you've got a financial system set up to ensure that it's long-term. Conservation easements can be negated if a court judge determines that the conservation values are no longer applicable. And there are amendments to the easement that can happen with good cause. Next slide, please. Again, not a random walk. We focus on the most important issues. I think we've covered pretty much all of this on this slide. Next slide, please. And so this is this idea of protected versus unprotected land. And, you know, our land is subject to changes in zoning and legal interpretation, financial pressures from the owner, and certainly changes in political priorities. And under a protected property, you remove the chance or uncertainty for the future use of that property under all of those different dynamic situations. And this becomes even more important, I think, locally here, given the fact that our lands are under phenomenal pressure and will only increase. And number two, we do have restrictions locally on what can be done as acknowledged and recognized and permitted out of Raleigh. So I think that's an important factor here. Next slide. So land trusts, Catawba Lands Conservancy, Davidson Lands Conservancy, we're both nonprofit organizations. We are in the business of establishing, holding, and defending conservation easements. This is what we do. The Conservancy, the Catawba Lands Conservancy, has a lot of acreage under easement. We have less, but we're still well heeled and well prepared. It's about 950 of these agencies across the country. And like I said, both of the ones locally are accredited, which is the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval for land trusts. Next slide. This is the Conservancy's background, 91. Conserved a lot of land, active in that area, and obviously promoted the Carolina Thread Trail. Bart can all speak to that better than I can. Next slide. Same thing for Davidson. Smaller agency, but punch way above our weight, as I like to say. And last slide. Oh yeah, okay. So this conservation successes, I think I'd like to change this to either partial successes or examples. And the first one I want to talk about is Abersham, and I'm going to go quickly through this. Next slide. So Abersham, we were asked by the community in Davidson, the town board in Davidson, and the mayor of Davidson to approach the county to conserve Abersham. And this all came out in the review of the the West Branch Stream Restoration Project, where the community got engaged in evaluating that project, and they learned that that Abersham is unprotected and owned by the county. Part of the rationale for the project, the Stream Restoration Project, was the fact that this was a public park. It also is a key connector for the Carolina Thread Trail, and it abuts Fisher Farm. And in this case, Abersham is at the very top. You can see the Iredale line. It's at the very top there, abutting Fisher Farm, if any of you are not familiar with that. I put this map up because conservation agencies like Davidson and Catawba, we think in terms of a mosaic of conservation. And again, we talked about strategic conservation. This is not a random walk. We are attempting to add the most value through our conservation efforts. In this case, it's parkland, it's protection of the West Branch and its corridor for wildlife and water quality. It's housing the Carolina Thread Trail, and it's all creating a mass of land that creates something really special in the community long term. So we were asked to produce this easement. We drafted an easement after carefully analyzing the resource of Abersham. Next slide, please. And this is a blow up of Abersham. Fisher Farm is in green to the south. And this is a map and exhibit that actually supports the draft easement that we presented to the county at the town's request. The darker orange is an area we would like to see highly protected with limitations on development. The orange is about 90 acres of land that would be wide open for any park use, any impervious surface, anything that the county would like to do that's park related, courts, active fields, or whatever. And this is a case where the easement would allow for flexibility so that the county would have 90 acres of land to develop for park use. It would have to be continuously used for park. It couldn't be for an alternative use. And the dark orange area are recognized in the easement for much like a nature preserve conservation, where there is pretty severe limitations on what could happen there. So it allows for reasonable use of the property. It accommodates the stream restoration project that's proposed. It protects those areas on a resource-based analysis that are most valuable to the ecosystem and the people. And so that's how a conservation easement can work and what we've proposed to the county. So I'm going to stop there. That's my last slide. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to share all this. I feel really, really strongly that this is an important thing for the future of our county and our communities as we go forward. And I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Do you want to see if anyone has any questions at this point, just before we move on? Anybody? All right, great.
All right, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Commissioner Rodriguez-McDowell. So moving on to some additional examples of conservation partnerships between Catawba Lands Conservancy and Mecklenburg County. Chris has already spoken about Gar Creek Conservation Area. As you've all heard, it's a critically important area because of its protection for water quality. So I'll just briefly highlight CLC's other work in this area. We have since 2000 completed 12 projects that have conserved, as you can see here, 394 acres of land, much of which is comprised of Gar Creek Nature Preserve. Again, this protects source water for Mountain Island Lake and has a direct connection to drinking water quality for residents of Mecklenburg County. And as mentioned, conservation easements are not altered by changes in zoning, which may occur during the course of development throughout an area. And through this partnership, we've also established a natural resources management partnership, which Chris alluded to. We do have Sean Bloom on our staff, or Bart Landis, if either of them have anything to add.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you, Amanda. I did want to speak briefly about the Natural Resource Management Partnership in the Gar Creek Conservation Area. Because of the work that we've done with Mecklenburg County, and we've really enjoyed this partnership, we now have the opportunity to partner with the Natural Resources Department in Mecklenburg County on prescribed fires. And so we're able to put good fire on the ground in this area and in other areas in Mecklenburg County and the surrounding region. And that's because of that partnership with Mecklenburg County. Additionally, during our, as Chris and Dave have both alluded to, as part of holding a conservation easement, Our staff must go out and monitor those properties at least once a year. And in doing so, that provides some additional eyes on the ground for the county and the county staff. And we've actually been able to identify trespass issues and illegal hunting issues and alerted the county to those problems. So it's been a really good partnership, and there's a lot of intangible benefits that we're realizing because of the conservation easement and the partnerships that come with it. This area also is important because of the Schweinetz's sunflower, which is a federally protected plant species. And through these conservation easements and the work of the county, this is a great spot for that protected plant.
Thank you, Sean. And we can move to the next slide, which really just contrasts here the impact of targeted, again, as Dave mentioned, key conservation areas being targeted in a particular footprint with a high degree of impact, both on the endangered plant species that Sean mentioned, the drinking water quality impacts that we've discussed, and as Chris said, the water quality contrast between two different areas of the county is quite stark here, as we can see Gar Creek Cove, which flows into Mountain Island Lake, and Browns Cove, which flows into Lake Wylie.
Look how hard it's raining out there.
And is in the Beaver Dam Creek watershed. We can move to the next slide. So if you'll go back one, just to highlight some of our previous conservation partnerships with Mecklenburg County. So we talked a lot about specific conservation areas, Gar Creek being one. We've also developed partnerships that allow us to target and conserve properties in key areas to advance Mecklenburg County greenways. Catawba Lands Conservancy was able to leverage funding from the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, a state funding source, to acquire a combination of conservation easements and fee ownership of property in the Long Creek area, which provided access for Mecklenburg County Greenway. Briar Creek Greenway was expanded because of Catawba Lands Conservancy's work with landowners on our Eastover Ridge Preserve. And finally, another example is the Lower McAlpine Creek Greenway, which there is a potential alternate alignment made possible by some of Catawba Lands Conservancy's work with acquiring fee interest in land in Pineville. We've also assisted with over 400 acres of park and nature preserve acquisition, including expansion of Cowan's Ford Nature Preserve. Chris already discussed Rocky River Bluff, the future Allen White Park, and Lakeview Park in Pineville. And each of these have had some different transaction structures that they've involved. In some cases, CLC has helped facilitate those transactions by initiating negotiations with a property owner and becoming involved to assure them that the property would be used for a preserve or park purpose. And additionally, we've had some less direct transactional involvement with Mecklenburg County. We were part of a stakeholder group, including Mecklenburg County, Gaston County, and other agencies that created the state-managed 2,000-acre Mountain Island State Educational Forest. So we've been able to leverage our expertise and experience with conservation, not only directly through holding conservation easements, but in this project planning and facilitation. If you'll go to the next slide, and this is my final slide here, we've also worked with towns and cities throughout the county to help facilitate trail projects. Our Carolina Thread Trail program of the organization provides technical assistance and catalytic funding in the form of our grants to those towns and cities really throughout the region, as well as just within Mecklenburg County, to create those trail connections and make possible linkages around the area for our communities to enjoy access to nature. We've also partnered with the City of Charlotte on the Tree Canopy Preservation Program, and our role there has been to help identify property, again, being targeted with our conservation work and identifying key areas to conserve. Following that identification stage, the City of Charlotte acquires those properties. The city retains ownership of the property, and one of the requirements of their program is that a conservation easement be granted to Catawba Lands Conservancy to ensure that the property is permanently protected in providing tree canopy for that community. And so we've worked with them on over 239 acres and have another 52 acres in the pipeline through that program. We've also been able to leverage some funding to provide support for other tree canopy projects, including the Urban Arboretum Trail. And CLC is the recipient of a grant that provides support for technical assistance, GIS analysis, and the work to create some ecosystem plans for those properties. And we've got some contact information here if anyone has additional questions outside of this presentation, but we can certainly all take some questions now as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to first go to Commissioner Altman and Commissioner Jarrell to see if they have questions. I'm not seeing any hands or, okay, Commissioner Jarrell.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So again, I guess, one, let me just say thank you all so much for the presentations. It really, really helpful. I mean, I think doubling down on the value of conservation easements and helping us to, or myself to really understand the value is important. I guess I still want to go back to the end of the last meeting and the discussion as it relates to the policy implications. And maybe Dr. Johnson, you can touch on where staff is and maybe some of the caution that you wanted us to think about as we move forward with respect to, again, I'll just term it as policy implications, if you all remember that. And then anybody that is a guest today and a partner, if you'd like to comment, particularly if you were here and had the opportunity to hear that discussion.
Sure, I'll try to respond to your question. We, as articulated in our introductory remarks, we as staff clearly believe we need to be proactive and continue to do things that we're already doing and possibly explore other things to ensure that we maintain and preserve our natural habitat and the green space that we have. And we also understand the interest to, if we're acquiring something for a park, that the intent and the use is for a park. And as you may be aware, you know, we already have some things that exist like in Park and Rec, like we ensure that when we get property for a park, that we're not developing more than 50% of it. So we're trying to ensure that even though we acquire land, we're not doing it and just planning on building on it in its entirety. Chris already shared, as well as our partners, where we do have partnership efforts out there for different types of scenarios where we are pursuing collaborative partnership and easement options and the like. So it is not a one size fit all. And I think some of the conversations that were starting to air at the last meeting was just make a blanket swoop and put, you know, easements on everything. And what my comment was trying to say, big picture, we understand the intent. Now, this is Leslie speaking. And while all of these tools that we have, we want to continue to use, Leslie was not suggesting that we do this blanket easements on everything and just say that's how we're going to approach it, because it could have other domino implications. It may be later on down the road, there was an instance where we wanted to have a trail to go through a park and create a greenway. It may not be something, it may be something else that's still a priority of the board. And how do we ensure that we achieve both without creating something that puts at complete adverse effects? And we don't know what those adverse effects would be in the future. Could the adverse effect be that we have cost implications that are 5 times than what it is in order to create this other alternative route if it's a pathway? And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't, but do we want to make it such that it has these other domino implications? And it's not a one size fits all of what those domino implications would be. So, and if we're too rigid, we may make it for those unknown expectancies that we don't know, that we are putting ourselves where we just can't do anything. And I don't think that's the intent of every person from the board, even though I believe everyone on the board does have an interest to do as much as we can to continue to preserve what we have and to ensure that we use it for the intended purpose.
Are we comfortable, and I want others to comment as well, and thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that. So I guess for me, where I'm hazy, do we feel like there are, again, I think it's been said multiple times that it's not a one size fits all approach, and so I respect that. But we are comfortable, I guess, with the fact that we have other tools that will provide the level of protection that we're all driving towards. That, I guess that's what we're saying with respect to not a one size fits all approach. And maybe Dave or Bart can chime in on that if you don't mind.
I'll take a swing at it, and then Bart, you can jump in here. I feel pretty strongly that a conservation easement is the best way to protect land. And you know, there are limitations on all of the avenues to protect land. And you know, I've heard from other people, why do we want to tie the hands of the county here with a conservation easement? Well, you want to tie the hands of the county to ensure that these precious assets and their conservation values are forever protected. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the easement, and you have to embrace that. As Bart mentioned at the end of the last meeting, you need to embrace that not as a negative, but as a positive. Now, I will say the easements do provide for a lot of flexibility in terms of when they're crafted. And in addition to that, they can be amended in those circumstances where the need, like Leslie mentioned, the possibility of putting a trail in if there was an easement, and I can't imagine an easement in this day and age that would not allow for a greenway. But if that existed, and there was a way to put the easement, the greenway in without compromising those conservation values, then the easement could be amended to accommodate that. And so I don't want to imply that these are great flexible instruments in terms of after they are cast, because they're not. But we can be thoughtful on the front end of crafting the easement to be careful to strike that balance of what the known and even unknown uses of parkland are, and what those conservation values are that have been there for 10,000 years and they need to be protected. We can find that balance. And I think with the county using these agencies, the Catawba and Davidson Lands Conservancy, they're great partnerships with, great agencies with great partnership track records, trusting relationships that are all focused on this common good of and common goal of protecting these key assets long term. So it's not a random walk. It's very strategic. We can be flexible in crafting these. And there are other ancillary benefits that come out of having a conservation easement as compared to a deed restriction. You have a partnership with a community player like an agency. Their partners get involved. They're, in terms of monitoring the awareness of the property. And when I look at Fisher Farm, we've got this wildlife enhancement collaborative that Krista and others in the county, Chris and others have been involved with, where we're partnering with the college and North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, the county, Davidson, the town of Davidson Lands Conservancy, to enhance the eco value of that property by restoring its wildlife habitat. Those are all ancillary benefits to having an easement on that property. So I think there's a middle ground here, and I'm not saying it's for every possible case of land that needs to be conserved, but it has proven to be the best way to conserve land over time institutionally across the country. And we're blessed with having this great partnership to build on going forward.
Yeah, that's really helpful, David. I'm not necessarily looking for middle ground. I really wanted to drive towards that discussion, to really drill down on the discussion that we were having at the end of the last meeting. So yeah, thank you for that. It's helpful for me.
Commissioner Drill, let me add really briefly that we've got the tools. These have been used in lots of places, including here in Mecklenburg County, and the tools are available, and we need to pick them and apply them well. And that has to do with foresight and thoughtfulness about what are the potential uses. And to echo what I said last meeting, is that the permanence is actually one of the benefits of these tools. And keeps us from being in a position where we have to defend ourselves against decommissioning parks and taking green space and turning them into developments. I mean, think about how odd it would be if New York City said, well, you know, Central Park's worth billions of dollars. We're going to start developing there. Just, you know, you don't want that. What you do need to do is what Dr. Johnson keeps saying, is being really thoughtful about which tool and what flexibility you need to build in.
Right.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Madam Chair. I'm gonna circle up offline with the rest of my questions. Thank you.
All right, great. Commissioner Altman, did you have more?
I would just ask Dr. Johnson, have we ever had an inventory prepared with all of our green assets, and then a column that says what its current status is, and then a column that says what you would recommend, because one size doesn't fit all? Like, do we have that kind of analysis? I think it might be good to inform the conversation. Thank you.
I'll defer in a few seconds to Director Lee Jones, Park and Rec Director Lee Jones. What I would say is that, yes, we have an inventory of all of our assets. Yes, we do know some properties that, and we know which ones we have easements on or deed restrictions and the like. So there's a universe of that. There are other ones that I know that staff may be aware of that we're pursuing. But is there an existing database for the purposes of how you asked, and it's all centrally located from that vantage point? I don't think so, but I'll ask Lee to chime in on it. The one other thing before I ask Lee to chime in is, what was I going to say? I now forgot it. The storm is passing through, so I'm multitasking in my head, so I apologize. Go ahead, Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And Commissioner Altman, thank you for that question. One thing that I've been working on since 2004 is trying to get my hands on, trying to create an up-to-date inventory on our property holdings. We did that with various folks that used to represent a department that was called Real Estate Services. It's now Asset Facility Management. And that included Nancy Brunham or Steve Law, and now Jacqueline McNeil and her staff. And now we've worked collaboratively, particularly since Chris Matthews and Bert Lynn have joined our department. We've sort of hiked up, and with the guidance of the Deputy County Manager Leslie Johnson, hiked up our activities with regards to how we go about pursuing land. So we do have an inventory of the land that we hold. I'm not 100% certain if on that spreadsheet there is a category that says if it has a conservation easement, does it have another type of easement or a deed restriction on the property? But that's something that we could do and prepare or update as necessary in order to have a sort of working document. But you asked another question, and I just want to make sure that I understood it. Or another part of your question was that says, I don't know, should we have one or shouldn't we have one? I think that's another discussion, or probably as a blooming the next stage of this, but we can certainly provide an inventory of the properties that we hold, particularly in park and recreation, and if they have deed restrictions or conservation easements on them.
And the one thing that I would say too, I mean, well, like I said, I didn't think we had something that just automatically exists in a database and we can say tomorrow we could print it out for you and have it. I think we have intel and perspectives and we could document it and get our arms around it. And if you would ask staff or ask me with regards to how do we begin, because we have these different tools, we may say, okay, for nature preserves, we need to explore and do this. For parks, we may need to do this. And it may not be even a one size, it may be even within a park, it's something different. But I think if this is something that this collective body wants us to kind of further pursue, I think we need to kind of give us that runway to give some other things to put before you. And it may be starting more big with some of the bigger assets that we have, because each one would be, and again, what I was trying to guard against based on the conversation that was at the last meeting is thinking it's one big swoop and you just say, oh, we put easements. And like you said earlier, Commissioner Altman, it's a little bit more complicated. And as our partner says, you almost do it, the agreement is by the site. And so it's different for each site of what you're trying to do. So that's the agreement and negotiations and everything like that for each parcel. So it may be some that are a higher priority that we really need to focus on. I'm not saying that everything isn't important, but how do you maneuver around all of this may need to be a strategy and approach of how we go about it, not just assume it's 100% of everything. And the legal ramifications, meaning, or the legal commitment, because to do all of it requires a whole lot of work to just say it's everything. And how do we go about it, and what's the best way, and where are we most at risk? Because of course, bigger parcels, you would be at a bigger risk. If the fear is development, bigger parcels would be more so than a smaller parcel, but there's just other things that we need to consider. And there's been instances, the other thing that I was saying is the domino that could occur. Sometimes we've had right, wrong, or indifferent land swaps, and it has been with a developer. And if something was so potentially so restrictive, and I'm not saying it would be that extreme, could we do the land swap to gain something that's really more beneficial for us than having this restriction that says you can't only use it as a park? I'm just using that illustratively. It has nothing to do with the restrictions that we have for, protecting certain species or wildlife or whatever, but there's been instances where we have swapped land with a developer and it was to our benefit to do the land swap. So, because it may have given us a more contiguous property or something like that. And I think all of those types of considerations need to be thought through as we're coming up with solutions to move us forward in this space. And the last thing that I was going to say that when I got distracted is you also have to be cognizant or have the awareness that some of our, I'm gonna call it like urban assets came over with the city of Charlotte with the merger. And so in a lot of the instances, we may have requirements that we have to continue to maintain it as a park, as part of how we acquired it. And if we don't, then we have to give it back to the city of Charlotte. So some of the parcels that we think of our inventory as owned may already have some pieces to it that are already somewhat restrictive, or they're restrictive for certain reasons, but not the entirety. So.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Well, I mean, this is a lot of work. It would be a big undertaking. So, I mean, I definitely think it's probably a good idea to queue up that there's a majority of the board supporting the work. And then, I think it would be good for us to actually have a spreadsheet with these 4 or 5 columns and triage it, and then really see, I think we should continue down the road of seeing if there's a majority of the board that wants to pursue this, because it's important, but it is not a light lift. It's a big deal. So we need to get, real buy-in from the whole board.
That is correct. And what I could say is what I would strongly recommend is, and I don't think this is something that can be done and it'll be at the next meeting, we'll have this information, because if we do it, we need to do it right, and we need to be intentional of what we bring back before you. But what I would say is, with that regard, is I would say that we could bring back to the committee something that starts, and again, neither the county attorney or the individual who's our real estate attorney is on this call, so I would want to ensure that they're part of the process of whatever we eventually bring before this committee. I would recommend, if to the best of our ability, it may be not in the weeds and very detailed, it may be bucket and categorized and help you understand how we're using some tools in some areas and give another chronology. I think why Chris was sharing with you some of the things like on some of our assets where we already have easements or deed restrictions and the like, and let us kind of pull together something that we can do what I'm gonna call at the macro level, not at the micro level. And then to see, depending on what that looks like, if it gets advanced to the board.
Thank you, Dr.
While I've
Johnson.
heard a couple interests, and I know individual interests, but I think there's general interest, but I don't know if there's definitive interest, the same strategy for each person. And I think we need to present some things to you to kind of see if that's initial steps that we can use to move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So I just want to add my own comments here as we draw to a close on our meeting. I want to say that the theme that I've been hearing over and over again is this idea of strategic placements, right? This is what we really want to do, is be strategic in using these tools. And also another thing that Mr. Cable mentioned, how runoff is the #1 issue. And I would just sort of maybe put forward thinking through, if that truly is #1 issue, maybe that's a good place for us to start in looking at where runoff is about to run amok or is running amok, and where we might need to really consider these conservation easements. Like that might be like when you're looking at a vast space, maybe prioritizing certain places, might make sense. And in my mind, I don't really see it exactly as a spreadsheet, but more of a map. And maybe that's, because I'm just sort of more visual that way. I'd love to see a map. And I don't know if this is already possible on GIS or something like that, where we can see these. But anyway, I think that I really have appreciated each one of you who have brought your expertise, Mr. Cable and Miss Byram. And sorry, everybody's moving around on my screen here, Mr. Landis. I also wanted to, in the spirit of Commissioner Powell, who wasn't able to make it, I know what she would say at the end of the meeting would be, are there any others in the community who are joining the meeting who have something that's burning that they would like to ask or put forward for our consideration as we move forward? As I do believe that we have a number of commissioners who are interested in going to the next level with this discussion. And so I think, as we all know, it takes 5 votes to do anything or to not do anything. And so I really would appreciate hearing from any community members in our last couple of minutes if they had anything burning that they wanted to bring forward. And Aaron, could you please, sort of facilitate that if you see any comments or?
Happy to. Certainly, Commissioner. We received a comment from Maureen Galuski, who stated, as an urban dweller of the county, I support conservation. The runoff and litter in our streams is concerning. I like the inventory idea.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Let me see. Is there anyone else that has a last comment before we look for a motion to adjourn? All right. Gosh, everyone, thank you so much for all of your expertise and input. Oh, Mr. Landis, were you raising your hand or just waving? Okay, just waving goodbye. Okay, just wanted to make sure. I think this was a lot of excellent information. And I really do appreciate the expertise that you all have brought to us today. So if this, I need to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, motion is made by Commissioner Altman and seconded by Commissioner Durrell. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That means we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.